Now to introduce our panel and to move on to the discussion. First of all, Sylvester Bayowo. Could you come up, please? Who is Development Planning Officer for the Local Government Service Secretariat in the Republic of Ghana. Quite fascinating work history there, as all of them do. Dr. Vijayendra Rao. Dr. Vijayendra Rao, lead economist in the Development Research Group of the World Bank. He's also been Dr. Samantha Nutt, already in place. I think you're supposed to be in the middle. So, in the middle. Okay. Once I can say where somebody seats. Sorry, and then Sasha Lezhnev, please. A policy consultant with Enough Project and co-founder of Grassroots Reconciliation Group. Lezhnev. And Ian Smillie, a famous name, one of the most influential voices in the humanitarian field, author of Freedom from Want and chair of Diamond Development Agency. Thank you. Well, thanks very much. I thought we should begin by asking, because all of you come from specific interest areas, and I'm sure each of you has, to some degree, separate priorities. If you could, in about 2 minutes, just 2 minutes, give us a sense of, when you focus down to where you want to concentrate, improvement and reform, where development in the future has to be, what most concerns you. If you can do that in a 2 minute, I'd like to go around the panel.
Well, it's a big question. I think what I'd like to see is that our government aid agencies, in this case Canada's CEDA, that we focus our energies on what we tell the taxpayers foreign aid is all about. We tell the taxpayers that it's about alleviating or ending poverty, but instead we use it for political purposes, we use it for strategic purposes. You know, we put a lot of money into Afghanistan, a lot of aid money into Afghanistan, and we talked about the need to develop Afghanistan, but what's happened since we pulled out the troops? We've cut the aid program in half. We're retrenching on the aid. The aid was not only about, or even mainly about, helping Afghanistan. It was, to a large extent, to support the military effort there. We've done this over and over and over. So I think the first thing is to focus on the purpose of aid and to be consistent. I think the second thing is we've really got to do something to inform more Canadians. This is a terrific turnout, but most Canadians are very supportive of aid, but I often say the support for aid is a mile wide and an inch deep.
I would back that up.
And when the cuts come, there's very little protest. And the cuts will come with the new budget, and we're already, as Samantha said, at the bottom of the pile. We're one of the stingiest donors out there.
Thanks, Ian. Sasha?
Yeah, thank you, Brian, and thank you so much to Samantha for organizing this. You know, I just got back from northern Uganda. I run a small organization out there, and as one of our consultations, I sat down with a man called Joshua who had spent the last 12 years of his life as a commander in the Lord's Resistance Army. And so I asked him, I said, well, you know, how did you escape? And he said, I didn't escape, I was captured, and in fact, I wish I was still there. And I was sort of taken aback. I was like, well, you know, how did that happen? Tell me more about that. And essentially what he said is like, well, my life in the bush with this horrible rebel group that has abducted over 66,000 children over the last 25 years was better than it is now. Out in the bush, I could have as many wives as I wanted to. I could eat and drink as I pleased more than anyone else. And now that I've come back here, you know, it's a lot of very difficult work, and frankly speaking, there are almost no projects for me to do here. So I would rather be a warlord out there in the bush. And so it made me think about both, you know, the symptoms and the causes of aid, and you know, made me think, okay, well, you know, first of all, in a lot of these wars that cause the humanitarian crises where we're channeling our aid, that there are so many bullies out there, essentially, you know, trying to wage war and abduct children and rape women, and there has to be some targeted approaches, whether economic approaches, whether targeted security approaches to combat those. And secondly, winning the hearts and minds of those who would be joiners of those organizations. So are we doing a good job at actually focusing on the individuals, making sure that there are incremental improvements for those folks, and that we're broadcasting those messages out effectively? And thirdly, what's our role in this situation? Now, take just a couple miles away in eastern Congo, there the war is fueled by minerals, tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold, the 3 T's in gold, that go directly into our electronics. And so we have a very active role in that situation, and there's a lot that we can do about that, and we can talk a bit more about that.
Sure. Samantha.
Well, I just wanted to pick up on what Ian has said as well. I mean, I see that the big challenges in the years ahead, actually in the very, very short term, cutbacks to ODA have already happened in the sense that it's been frozen. I think it's going to be much deeper and much more severe with the next budget and moving forward. We have this perception that aid is dispensable, that when times are tight, that it's the one thing that we can afford to squeeze. And I would argue that the opposite is actually true. When times are tight, that squeeze is already being felt in the most acute sense among the poorest of the poor, especially in other corners of the world, and that is precisely the time for us to demonstrate the measure of our generosity. So I think it's actually counterintuitive to begin cutting aid at the precise moment where aid is really required. But that's going to require, that in and of itself is going to need a tremendous amount of public influence and public input into that process. And where I think that there's reason to be concerned is just the overall lack of interest in international development and human rights concerns, the lack of interest in foreign affairs, international news reporting. I mean, this is a wonderful audience here tonight, but in the general kind of mainstream audience, you wouldn't get this many people who are as knowledgeable and as committed and as interested to these subjects as what you'll find in this room tonight. So that's a major issue. The other major issue that I see has to do with the evaporation of the humanitarian space. And there are a couple of reasons for this, and one of them is the ongoing militarization of aid, the merging, and Ian touched on this a little bit, of our aid policy with our defense policy, aid as a way of achieving our strategic counterterrorism agendas and military agendas around the world. And it's not just Canada that's doing this, but other countries, including the United States. And you also have increasing military engagement in aid and relief operations, which then politicizes aid even more than it already is, which has tremendous repercussions, both in terms of local communities on the ground, because where their participation in these programs puts them at higher risk. They're attacked at much higher rates than traditional aid programs. But it also is creating a situation where aid organizations can't respond effectively in the ways that they used to, and where attacks against aid workers are up by almost 200% over the past decade, is something that we as an organization face increasingly. This notion that you can be in a situation where you're representing an aid organization and be afforded a certain level of immunity. Those days are long over in many countries around the world, and that is actively impeding our ability to respond to those in need at precisely the moment when those needs are about to get a lot greater.
Dr. Rao?
I don't like the word aid. I prefer the word investment. I prefer the word capacity. I prefer the word partnership. Aid, to use the word that Samantha just used, I agree a lot with Samantha, so I'm not really attacking you on this.
It's in the title.
But I know. As is Nutt. but the word generosity is not a word I like. This is not about charity. It is about building partnerships with countries with whom you can trade in the future, with whom you can have a mutually synergistic economic and political and social relationship. It is about building the capacity of people to help themselves in a variety of spheres. The philosophy of aid, I sort of see my organization, the World Bank, as being one that sort of thinks of the long term, thinks about, really invest in the long term, and is an example of how successful collective action across countries around the world after World War II, the Bretton Woods Agreement, came up with these institutions that in a moment that seems to have been forgotten, and we don't do it that often anymore, but that was a great moment when Keynes and others came together and proposed these organizations to think of the long term. One was the firefighting organization, the IMF, the National Monetary Fund. The World Bank was about long-term investment and long-term development. That is how I would like to think of that sphere. Therefore, I agree with what Samantha is saying, that if the aid business, as it is defined today, the NGO sector, the bilaterals, started thinking more along those lines, the advantage that they have over us is that they're much, ironically, are probably more flexible. They're less bound by the sorts of bureaucratic structures that we are. It may seem odd, we can debate that, which means that take the Nordics, for instance. The Japanese, they allow for a great deal of experimentation in how they give their aid. Pilot projects all the time. That experimentation can be made more scientific. Therefore, we learn about new modalities that can be scaled up by organizations like mine. So there has to be a different philosophy of thinking, how do we actually bring the rest of the world, onto an equal playing field? Not about charity, of giving from rich to the poor.
Sylvester, please, Bayowo.
Yeah, thank you very much. I want to thank Samantha and World Child for this opportunity to be on this platform with our guest here. On a typical day, you wouldn't find a Ghanaian in a print like this and a suit. It is only in Canada you'll get a Ghanaian in a typical dressed out like this because of the weather. Yeah, so I'm really grateful for this opportunity. For me, with the little experience that I've had in organizations and from the local government point of view, I believe that aid, for it to be effective, should be channeled or geared towards the aspirations and visions of the nation that the aid is being offered to. I mean, we have aid that are coming and comes with strings attached. You have aid that come and say, okay, we're giving you this amount of money, but this and this, or this sector and that sector is what we want you to invest these aid into. The country has its own aspiration, it has its own vision, it has its own long-term ideas. But aid comes and then says, no, you put this aside and you go into these areas. Can you imagine, say, a city like Toronto with its long-term visions? I've been visiting a lot of organizations here, and typically you'll find a typical organization with about 20 to 15 years long-term plan. Imagine, in my case, there's a similar thing, and then, or in our country, there's a similar thing, and then aid comes and says, no, you put this aside, and you concentrate on this. How do you think development is going to progress? We're just going to be going back and forth, and we're never going to get anywhere. The other thing that I want to talk about is that aid should be geared towards building the already existing institutions that are within the country, to make sure that when the aid ceases, or when aid is no more coming, like we're currently facing, aid is gradually dropping, countries are reducing their funding support to countries. When these aid are no more coming, the existing institutions that are already there are already strengthened enough to deliver what is expected of them, to deliver the services, the infrastructure, and all that for their communities, to make sure that they are stabilized. So for me, these are my opinions, and these are one I want to share with you. Thank you.
Okay, great. That's a great opening of some priority thoughts. I want to get to right down to a specific point, to something very specific to talk about. A lot of us would want to talk about, and I certainly would, development aid, long-term development aid. But the last 2 years, as Samantha mentioned in her speech, have seen horrifying examples of where emergency aid in this world is being absolutely chaotically messed up. Haiti being one example, the whole slow response to East Africa, which caused so much trouble and led to such disaster, the infighting between various aid organizations. What really struck me about it was that the level of public misunderstanding of what aid groups are doing, the level of misunderstanding about what government's role is, the level of understanding what the logistics, the hardship of aid is. It strikes me that we're in a very perilous position if this continues. This level of awareness is disastrous. The British government had a report on aid which said, we are in a race against human catastrophe in this planet, and we are not winning the race because we're not bringing it together. I'd like to ask panelists who want to respond, how did the world make such a mess of these major events? What are the key failings here that probably could be corrected in a couple of years, but are not being corrected? And how on earth do you explain that the public that would come up to me and ask, about what to do last year, we're asking the same questions they were asking me 27 years ago after Ethiopia. We don't seem at times to even learn how to respond, or we learn and it's erased from our memory. Who'd want to start on that, Ian?
Well, there's two types of emergency. One is what they call fast onset emergency, like the tsunami, something that just comes out of the blue. And basically you have a disaster, you treat the wounded and the hungry, and then you have a reconstruction period, and then you get into development. It's sort of a logical sequence of events. But then you have complex emergencies, long complex emergencies like Sudan or Somalia. And in fact, I'd argue that Haiti probably is a complex emergency. It wasn't just the earthquake. The earthquake was added on to every other imaginable problem. And we tend we tend to deal with symptoms. We tend not to be there for the long term. You know, we were all very gung-ho on Haiti in the mid-90s. We sent in peacekeepers. We did all kinds of things. In 2 years, we disarmed, we disbanded the army and trained a new police force and did all kinds of wonderful things, except 2 years later, we were gone. We did it in a half-assed way, and we didn't stick around. And guess what happened? 10 years later, it's the same kind of thing. I mean, countries like Haiti, and for any country that is in that kind of condition needs long-term development assistance and investment. I guess what is so tragic is that even the aid agencies themselves see it in short-term tranches. And when you do get aid money, when you do get emergency assistance money, it comes in 3-month, 6-month dole-outs from the institutional donors. CEDA doesn't fund any relief organization for more than 3-6 months at a stretch. So they don't have any predictability. They don't have any long-term vision. It's like the fire is over. So instead of everybody going back to the fire station, you disband the fire brigade. The fire brigade has to disband completely, and every time we have another emergency, we have to start all over again.
Anyone else want to speak to that? The one thing that did strike me watching Haiti and watching also the East Africa was a lack of kind of a central control mechanism. There was no command structure. Governments hung back until they had headlines they could respond to. Ministers wouldn't go there until the pictures were so bad that they could go there and be sure they'd be covered. There seemed to be a kind of absence of clear head thinking. Who would like to respond to that?
Let me just say a couple of things. Firstly, disasters are messy things. I mean, they're unpredictable, messy things. Anytime in human history, that's always been the case. So it's always going to be an uncertain, risky process of what you do, how you coordinate. It's just a difficult task. So let's keep that in mind. Having said that, there's several things that can be improved. And one of the things that always strikes me is the point actually Samantha raises in a book, which is the incentives that various donor agencies, including mine, have to protect their turf, which means that they don't coordinate with others, and that's the point you're making, which is a seriously problematic thing which needs to be resolved. The second thing related to that is, so I can give you an example from Southern Sudan some years ago, some decades ago actually, where there was a famine coming on, and food relief organizations went in there and tried to check around for malnutrition and found no malnutrition, and said because there's no malnutrition, there's no famine. The reason was that in the culture of that region, the Dinka culture, whatever food is available is equally shared with everybody. No family thinks of its food as a private good. It's all a public good. So as the food diminishes, it diminishes the same way for everybody in the community, right? Which means that while levels of food intake are going down, you're not going to get some kids malnourished and others not, right? So you can't identify, there's a bunch of 10 kids that was malnourished, even though everybody's fine, famine's coming, you don't see it. What happened was that everybody got malnourished at exactly the same time. It was a disaster. Remember the Great Sudan famine? And that's when all these, folks got into action instead of doing it much earlier. So why was that? Because they didn't have the good sense to speak to an anthropologist, and many great ones, Mary Douglas in UCL being one of them, who knew something about Sudanese culture. Okay? What is the norm that works? So this kind of lack of information is a really, really serious problem, and I don't know why it doesn't get resolved.
But even when you have the information, as in East Africa, you had early warnings that a famine was coming. You had very competent groups on the ground, some at least very, very competent groups on the ground, that were sending reports into the United Nations. And just as happened in Ethiopia in 1984, or many other places in the world, governments were risk adverse. They didn't seem to want, they had the right matrix. They wanted to see real evidence before they did something. And of course, the media was making everything worse because in their minds, a famine is only provable when you have starving children on camera. And until the world sees the starving children, governments aren't going to respond, perhaps. Agencies will be slow. And of course, we then always get there too late because when you have starving children on camera, it is way, way too late. Samantha, you've been in.
But I think in the context of the most recent famine in Somalia, I think there were two variables that figured into the very slow response. One was the crisis in the Eurozone, and it was very difficult for international government donors to actually think beyond their sort of immediate short-term crisis, and especially to then begin making major financial announcements. There are political realities and considerations that come into, unfortunately, that kind of decision-making. They should not. The reality is that there should be enough money available because we don't have enough consistently applied ODA. There should be enough money available in revolving funds through the United Nations and through other groups that we then don't have to rely on new checks coming in, that we can actually mount and coordinate a response. So that technical capacity should exist. It does not exist.
A stockpile, right?
So that's one thing that's a problem. The second thing with Somalia was this sense of which we see all the time, which is compassion fatigue. You know, when you compare the response to the Haitian earthquake compared to what was happening in Somalia, it was so dramatically different. Part of that was, you're right, it was the images that were coming out, it was the proximity of Haiti to us here at home. But with Somalia, there was also that sense of, well, why is this happening again, and haven't we done this before, and why does aid never work? And so there's that inherent cynicism when it comes to the importance of humanitarian assistance that I think undermines our abilities to be effective. But further to the point that was raised earlier is, you know, I find it really intriguing that when it comes to any kind of natural disaster in particular, or even a slower disaster, war, for example, that you have groups that will flock to the area. Often they're not required to have any experience, they're not required to have any license, they're not mandated to coordinate, and I find that still extraordinarily shocking. I mean, the UN has what's called cluster groups. For those of you who've read my book, you know that I add a particular four-letter word at the end of the word cluster. But to describe that experience, which it really is, and the astonishing thing for me is that these are all volunteer initiatives. So if a group decides it wants to participate, it will, but if it decides it doesn't have time to participate, doesn't want to take instruction from anybody else, and wants to just continue on with its free-for-all and jockeying in front of the cameras, it's perfectly entitled to be able to do that. And I think that that's negligent and wrong. And I also think that you need to be able to establish your added value in those situations and your relevant expertise before you go and get on a plane in a set of matching t-shirts and start handing out food and water. And it's astonishing to me that you need a license to have a pet, but you don't need a license to actually get on a plane and call yourself, you know, a humanitarian and to begin trying to save lives, whatever that ostensibly looks like.
I think it has been said that we're up to 10,000 groups working in Haiti at one stage. Incredible, you know, some 3 mom and pop organizations, you name it. I just want to throw in quickly, I'll say several times, I think the media is at great fault here. And one of the things I think we have heard aid groups is we have never explained just how tough it is to do this work. Very few people have a sense of how tough it is to bring enough aid to Somalia or to work in a condition like Haiti. But I throw the questions back to you now, where agencies must have failed because they're adding to cynicism surely when they get into these great competitions over money. And people are watching night after night, World Vision, and then another one, and the humanitarian relief. There is this kind of sense that what's going on out there? Why can't they bring their act together?
Well, there is an attempt in this country to finally bring the NGOs together and at least coordinate the fundraising. There is a humanitarian coalition which consists of Plan, Oxfam Canada, Oxfam Quebec, CARE, and Save the Children. So at least the fundraising costs are going down. Where it will really start to pay off is if they coordinate their work overseas and also encourage evaluations. You know, there's very, very little public evaluation of humanitarian assistance. So people are very generous in their donations, but there's very little follow-up. And so you do get reporters going back a year after or 2 years after, and they say, oh my God, look, it's still a mess. But there's no serious evaluation of what happened. I agree 100% with Samantha about this rush, everybody rushing off. What is it about this business that makes everybody think that they can do it better than the professionals? Why is there so much cynicism about organizations like UNICEF or CARE or Oxfam? Why do people think the money doesn't get there? Why do they begrudge a professional salary to an accountant or to a doctor or anybody else who goes off into these tough places and does this kind of work? There's something very odd in our attitude towards charity, that we want the money all to get to the person. We don't want to pay any overheads. What's the overhead at the Bank of Montreal? What's the overhead at this university? Do we ever question it? No. Why do we question it in charitable organizations? They should have proper overheads so that they can get the job done properly.
You and Dr. Rao were in an article, op-ed piece this week, both referred to the need to be more open, transparent, and accountable. And you mentioned the fact that we have simply got to admit failure. And I wondered all the way through the last couple of years if part of the big problem was nobody in this game wants to admit to failure. The media doesn't want to admit it fails. The aid groups usually don't want to admit it fails. So the public's sitting there saying, well, how do I know what works? They always say it works, but how do we know? Could you give us your idea on where we don't help ourselves when we refuse to admit failure?
Well, I mean, you know, I must say that a lot of people are responsible for this. Governments, no government wants to admit failure because it has political consequences. No NGO wants to admit failure because if it does, nobody will give them money. No individual wants to admit failure because if they do, they can get promoted. I mean, you know, the incentives go all the way from the top, bottom. How you change that is a hard problem. I mean, let's acknowledge that first. However, I guess the point I was making was that it seems astonishing to me that firstly, as the point Inu was making, this money, the spending of it is not evaluated properly. Secondly, it is not even tracked properly. And my organization is guilty of this as any other. We don't even monitor properly. You know, I just finished. I just finished a review of 300 design documents at the World Bank on participatory projects around the world, total of $85 billion worth of projects, right? What is astonishing to me about this review, and it's in the book, this is all public information. None of this is private, it will be public very soon. The amount of cutting and pasting that goes on between different designs. And you look at a project in Indonesia, a project in Sudan, a project in Malawi, cut, paste, cut, paste, cut, paste, right? I mean, they're not even thinking about context, firstly. Secondly, they talk about monitoring systems, and only 40% of these design documents talk about monitoring systems. 60% don't even mention the word monitoring system. So they don't even talk about it. I mean, so at least, let's go to the 40% that do talk about it. You look at, studies of whether they actually do it well, about 20% of those do it well. So it seems to be the last priority. Nobody seems to care about it, and then we ask them, why is it not happening? Well, that's the country's responsibility. It's not our responsibility. They have to do the monitoring system well. Then somebody's got to enforce that. Somebody's got to give incentives for this. It doesn't happen. Sorry, I'm going crazy.
Sylvester.
I'm right behind you.
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, I think that we are not also telling the positive side of these are humanitarian achievements. I mean, the voice of cynicism compared to the voice of the beauty and the achievements and the great works that are going on at the ground, the voice of cynicism seems to be much higher. And it looks like that is what people are ready to hear or ready to listen to. And so I think that there should be more effort to media, the organizations that are involved, to also, as much as possible, raise the voice of the achievements, the successes of some of these humanitarian achievements to that level that it will win people's hearts. And I think that we can go a long way to push this humanitarian efforts forward. Yeah.
And I do think there is more discussion around failure now within the NGO community. Engineers Without Borders has pioneered a failure study to look at this specific issue and to encourage NGOs to be much more upfront about what's working and what's not working, to the extent that organizations are actually asking those questions. And that is one of the great frustrations. And it also is one of the great frustrations that that isn't valued. In the rush to say, well, we're spending all the money at the field level, we're not actually being rigorous and investing in looking at whether that money is being well spent and what that actually looks like. So, and you have to pay for that as well. So that's the first thing about that. And other organizations are following suit as well. I know that Doctors Without Borders, MSF, that they have a book that's coming out shortly that has actually looked at some of their failures around the world and where they may have inadvertently been contributing to regimes that have actually prolonged the conflict and taking a very hard look at their models. And so I think that the more that organizations are willing to embrace this kind of dialogue, and the more, and I put this back to the supporters as well, the more that the supporters of those organizations are prepared to say, we value this, we want to hear this from you, we are with you through that process, the more bold we can afford to be. And until that actually happens, until you have that core network of supporters who are prepared to say, we're going to invest in you, we want to know this information, we want to help support you despite the things that you're doing well and the things you're not doing well, until that actually happens, it's going to continue to be triggered by groups that just want to put out a particular story and generate the revenues that come from that good story.
Yeah, I was just going to build on what Sam was saying, and you know, I don't think that putting in place a lot of these accountability and transparency systems is all that costly. It's not that complicated. It's something that we do in business here every day, in government every day, right? I mean, so the checks and balances, there are things that you can do, low-cost things, but the mentality in so many aid organizations and development agencies is, you know, spend, disperse. That's you know, what they're out there to do because they want to get more money and spend it and prove that they spent X amount in the field, you know, but just having an extra pair of eyes or an extra organization, you know, look over your accounts or setting up, you know, surveillance systems for accountability and so forth. It's not that difficult, but, you know, just it's not built into so many of these different projects. You know, in our very small organization, you know, I often have to say no to donors because we're like, well, no, we can't spend that money yet. We really need to track every penny that we're spending right now.
You know, I don't think we should give people the impression that there's no monitoring or evaluation. My comments on evaluation were about evaluation in the emergency field. It may be true that the World Bank doesn't do.
Oh, no, the World Bank does it better than anybody else.
Which may explain.
I know that. I know that. That says something a lot about the others. At least we have a monitoring, you know, unit.
I often tell people who are students of international development, if they want to read three books that are important, the three books that I think are essential reading on international development. The first is the Pearson Report. Samantha referred to Lester Pearson's study of international development after he left the prime ministership, written in 1969.
Now everyone knows how old I am, Ian.
You said. That book talked about all of the problems of international development at that time, and it's surprising and shocking to read it today to see how valid almost everything continues to be. Second terrific book by Robert Chambers called Rural Development, Putting the Last First. And the third one, in the context of what we're talking about here, is a book by Dennis Rondinelli. He wrote it about 20 years ago, and I think it's called Development Assistance as Policy Experiment. He says it's all experimental. If we knew how to end poverty, we would have done it a long time ago. If we knew how to create jobs for 18-year-olds who are on the brink of getting into a gang or an army, we would have done something about that a long time ago. If we knew how to fix the problem of Haiti, the earthquake wouldn't have been nearly as bad as it was. The trick about experiments is that you have to learn from them, and this failure to learn from failure is a chronic problem, and it's created by the institutional donors as well as the $10 donors who think the money doesn't get there just because they heard a horror story. We have in CEDA at the moment, to use an expression that was coined by Andrew Natsios, who was head of USAID a while back, he called it an obsessive measurement disorder. There is too much monitoring and too much evaluation and too much focus on numbers and not enough on learning and remembering and applying the lessons that we've learned. So we keep repeating the same mistakes over and over again.
Actually, that's very interesting. That is one area where I have found, working with both, the military are way ahead of aid groups in this area.
And the
because-
corporates. And the corporates.
Yeah, because they're, certainly in the military sense, after every operation, they do a lessons learned, and it is ruthless how they break down what went well, what went not so well. Yes, sorry.
Can I just make a quick suggestion? I mean, all these young people here who are interested in development, and I suspect all of you want to go into the aid business in some way or the other or be involved with it. But here's a thought. What if you don't do that, but instead go into the monitoring business, right? You go out there and and Engineers Without Borders, I mean, I'm sure that you're doing a whole bunch of wonderful stuff, but I'm wondering if you do this. Do you train folks how to go and do engineering measurements to see whether the actual structure that's been constructed by the government of India, the government of Ghana, or whoever else, is actually worth the amount of money that was spent on it, right? Because that difference is corruption. If you train people how to assess corruption with an engineering background, you're doing a great service to improving the monitoring system.
I would like to move a little, actually, quite a ways on now, because we've been discussing the horrible events of the emergency relief and the quagmire there we have to fight our way out of. I'd like to look now for long-term development, and a sense there that in some areas things are going better than expected, in some areas not so well. How important, what's critical in all your minds to get right now in long-term serious development that we're going to need on this planet over the next 20, 30 years? I mean, Samantha, what do we need to get right that we're not getting right now? And that includes a role of government.
Well, I mean, I think the two biggest things from a long-term development perspective, and I addressed this in my opening remarks, obviously education and income generation. And what the income generation piece, there are different ways that you can approach that. You can approach that through governmental level. You can approach that through external investment. You can approach that through small business development and entrepreneurship at the local level. That's what I prefer to see. I like to see that kind of investment in local capacity building, in microfinance initiatives, in creating revolving funds, especially for women, in supporting those kinds of market-generated opportunities so that people can actually move towards a place of greater autonomy and greater financial self-reliance. We know, I mean, we do study this quite a bit, and we know that this does have a tremendous impact on families and their security, and also on the rate of recidivism in terms of young people going back out into the militias if these other alternatives do exist. So I see that as being absolutely fundamental to where we need to go from a development policy point of view over the next 10 years. We believe, when we talk about things like maternal and child health, we believe that if we focus on those things in and of themselves, that all of these things exist in a silo, and in fact they do not exist in a silo. Everything is interconnected. In fact, a fantastic study that was done recently that was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation looked at 30 years of demographic data on girls, and starting in 1979, and they found that for every extra year that a girl in the developing world receives in terms of education, child mortality actually drops by 10%. I mean, these are astonishing numbers. And so for as long as we continue to focus on the end outcome, which is high infant mortality, high child mortality, high maternal mortality, without investing in those structural challenges, we're going to continue to see these deficits exist.
Are we divided up here, and I look to you again, Dr. Rao, on the whole question of what works in terms of size? Whether large organizations have more impact than the small. I've seen some extraordinarily successful small organizations that seem to work at the grassroots in a way that large ones don't. But your sense is that really it's the large ones that have to carry the game.
No, actually, I believe they're entirely complementary. They're both necessary, and for the following reason. Small organizations can be enormously more flexible when they do their job well. And they can also be much more amenable to experimentation and learning. So in fact, some of the most innovative ideas we have in development assistance today have come from small organizations trying different things. I mean, the whole livelihoods thing, which is now I'm involved in the $5 billion livelihoods project in India. It all started with the Aga Khan Rural Support Project, which is a tiny little project in Pakistan. So, and it's now spread all over the world. That thing, that's what small organizations can do. And large organizations can learn from those lessons. And they can also build a base, by the way. They can build a base in this countries of civic capacity to participate in the development process. I mean, small organizations doing their jobs well can do that really well. Large organizations can then build on that and take them to scale. and take those ideas to scale, and then, when they work, and taking them to scale involves a whole bunch of problems, but is necessary in order to alleviate poverty on the large scale. So I think they're both equally necessary.
And that's encouraging. Sylvester?
I think I need to be taking the mic from Rao more often because he told me he wasn't going to share the mic with me, and he's exactly doing that. Anyway, from my perspective, I believe strongly that aid, or from government point of view, should be concentrating on strengthening already existing institutions. I've already mentioned that. I mean, aid should be concentrating on the processes that the government systems are executing their activities. Should be concentrating on improving upon these processes, these systems, to make sure that they actually deliver their mandates. So that when all these aid thing ends, which always does all the time, they always come 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, they always have an end. We can have these systems up and running and delivering what is expected of it. And I think that that's one sure way from government's point of view, because I'm currently on this local service delivery and governance program being sponsored by the Danish government. It is allowing the government system to run, its financial system, its governing body to run on its own. And it is just the donor is just sitting back, watching the system, and say, hey, look at this, look at that. You need to check this, and you need to check that, and you need to improve upon this, you need to improve upon that. And things, at least there are results that we are seeing. So I think that these are some of the focuses that we should be
Can the ideological battle be won? I mean, you only have to watch on U.S. television now and other areas. The whole offensive that's been building year after year, that aid is counterproductive, it doesn't work. Is the aid area actually in a position to be able to go out and really counter that with solid evidence of solid proof where it has worked? I know you get into these struggles quite a bit with them.
Well, I think so. I think you can demonstrate that aid works in all kinds of ways. Lots of aid doesn't work, but it was never meant to work. It was meant to grease the skids for commercial interests or strategic interests. We gave money to Mobutu Sese Seko and Siad Barre and the Duvaliers. They didn't waste it. We wasted it, and we didn't give it to them. I mean, to alleviate poverty. If any of that happened, it was a side effect. So we wasted the money. So I think it's important that we look at what was intended as aid, was intended to alleviate poverty, and evaluate it and tell these stories more widely. But I think there's another thing. It isn't all about aid. I mean, aid is not what is going to end poverty in a poor country. It can help, but it's not the only thing. It's going to be their own efforts. That's what's going to be most important. And they have to have access to markets, and they have to be able to fight back against farm subsidies in the United States or in Europe. And they have to be allowed by the IMF to subsidize their own farmers if there isn't going to be a level playing field. But we have to understand that the idea of poverty, the effects of poverty, which used to be over there somewhere and could be stopped at borders, all that's changed. Poverty, their future now is our future. Our future is their future. The effects of pollution and conflict and poverty and bad ideas, dangerous ideas, and people moving, all of these things now have a major impact on us, a direct impact on us. So this aid can't be just something bolted onto the side of a foreign policy, not just a slush fund for this minister or that minister. It has to be something that's really intrinsic to our foreign policy, something that we really want to use to end poverty. We have to make it do what we tell the taxpayers, what we've always told the taxpayers it was about, but we haven't used it for.
And not just to give Canada some advantage in some part of the world for trade, as it seems to be doing now, where we have this sudden love affair with concentrate on Latin America and deserting some areas in Africa. Sasha, do you have something to add?
Just a few miles to the south of here where I'm based in Washington, aid is a big political football, right? And we're having our election now. And I actually think the other side, as I would call it, is coming around a bit. In fact, one of the big presidential candidates defended aid to his constituents just last week, saying that, Rick Santorum, amazingly enough.
I don't think he's going to win, though.
No, well, so, but I think one area that it's very.
He was talking about Wall Street.
He was thinking of the wrong kind of aid package.
But I think one area that we're actually hoping to make some progress on and need to make some more progress on is corporate accountability. There was a study done a couple of years ago about the money that flows around Africa, and the amount of oil, gas, and minerals that get exported is 10 times the amount of aid that comes in. And so, the trick is there, actually making sure that the oil, gas, and minerals are spent, or first of all, that the transfers are made in a transparent manner, and second of all, that they're spent in a transparent manner. And that's still a huge, huge question. But there are some initiatives that are starting to change that. The Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, started by Tony Blair, the Kimberley process on diamonds. There's a law that passed last year in the U.S., Dodd-Frank, which is having some accountability on minerals purchases. But that is still a very, very, very large area, and to a large extent, corporations get a free rein in these very poorly governed countries and essentially paying lots and lots of bribes. And in fact, in some countries, it's actually, you get a tax break for paying a bribe, like in France. So
I want to turn to
Here they get
questions.
government subsidies.
I want to turn to questions from the audience. I keep looking nervously around for the questions that are supposed to be coming up. There are questions being collected. I'll go to them shortly. But one question I'm interested in any area, the personnel is terribly important. And I wonder, from all your observations, is the aid field getting the right quality of people now? Can it afford to employ the right quality of people? Do people have opportunities to work, at creative jobs in the aid field? How does that, given all the opposition it comes up to, given the dangers, Samantha, you've talked about in the field, what's your sense about the quality of people that are being drawn still into the aid field?
I would say outstanding, and I say that not just because almost everybody from War Child is here. I'm always amazed. There are increasing numbers of educational undergraduate programs and postgraduate programs that are actually focusing on international development, international relations, NGO management, and I'm astonished at the level of competency and skill that people are now coming to us with. Now, it's certainly true that when you're working in places that are very dangerous, where the living conditions are very difficult, that sometimes you might have a high turnover of people at the local level. But again, that shouldn't be your priority. Your priority should always be your national staff, your national teams, your local organizations, the investments that you're making in them. And so then any external expertise that may be required for the purposes of supporting monitoring or training or evaluating, that can afford to be much more sort of fluid, and that those people can turn over more quickly, as long as you've got your core team on the ground that is properly trained. But that, again, takes time. Our program in Darfur, we have close to, at one point we had close to 100 full and part-time national staff, and it took about 2 years for us to gear up to that level of talent and sort of self-direction at the field level before we could get there.
One thing that's changing is a lot of the development experts in developing countries are not foreigners anymore. They're local people. Some of the best NGO workers now are, and some of the best NGOs are local organizations. BRAC, a Bangladeshi organization that I've written about, probably the biggest NGO in the world. The biggest NGO in the world. How many people here have heard of it? BRAC. It's good for you. And if you haven't read my book, please do. It's awfully good. But they're not just the biggest. I think they're one of the best, and they've spread out from Bangladesh to other countries in Asia. They're the biggest NGO, foreign NGO in Afghanistan. They're in southern Sudan. They're in Haiti. They're in Somalia. They're in some of the toughest places, and we don't notice them. We don't notice that there has been this change going on. And just to go back to something that Sylvester said, one of the most important things about making aid effective, long-term effectiveness, is to make sure there is adequate funding, predictability, and good, solid partnerships if it's outsiders doing this, they've got to have good, solid partnerships with local governments and local organizations.
Just to that point, I mean, I think it's very tough. I think, overall aid money is down everywhere, given the financial crisis and all that. We just put out an advertisement for a program manager position that pays $12,000 a year. It's tough to attract people with that. If anyone wants to apply, please, grassrootsgroup.org. But at the same time, that's not the only place where you can make a big difference in the developing world, right? You don't have to be an aid worker in Darfur to have a big impact there. You can be an activist. You can, write, contribute to articles in your local newspaper. You can stage a demonstration. You can influence your corporation to have a positive impact. I think there are all kinds of different ways. People think like, well, I have to be, that doctor saving babies in Eastern Congo. Well, you don't, although you could be.
I've never done that. I'm a public health doctor.
Can I just make one point on your point? I mean, I totally agree with Samantha. The quality of people applying for international development programs and staffing is, in the 20 years that I've been in this business, has really, really gone up. I mean, it's astonishing. But what's gone down is people on the streets protesting. You don't see that anymore. The big Seattle protests, you don't see that anymore. And I don't know what's happened to young kids. They don't seem to be motivated. I mean, they were protesting the Iraq war for a while, which is fine. That sort of took attention away from this stuff. But now the Iraq war is done, Come back to protesting development issues.
You missed the Occupy movement.
No, the Occupy movement was didn't have anything to do with development aid. It had to do with, local inequality, very important. But protest against us. And there used to be a time when I walked into my office, I had to go through miles of big puppets and people screaming at me. Doesn't happen anymore. I wish it did.
Those Occupy Wall Street people are coming down the road.
If any of you would like to arrange for that on his way out, you feel free.
Okay, I have some questions from the audience now and our cue cards, and I'll throw this out. How can, just what we're talking about, but it may get more specific, how can NGOs attract intellectual capital and talent when the donor expects them to work for compensation under market value? We've kind of answered that, but it is a problem that I see all the time in news stories. Organizations having to emphasize over and over again, we only spend 4% or whatever it is on overhead. Well, somebody said here earlier, overhead's awfully important. I mean, if you're going to have solid people in your office, you need decent overhead, and you can't do without it. Marketing approaches to development are both gaining popularity and being portrayed in innovative ways and proving. Does the focus on profit and marketing undermine the efficacy of development work? Does the focus on profit and marketing somehow take away from development work? I'm not quite sure what it was, because half the time you're out, more than half the time you're out there trying to build markets, or you're not. Build local communities to sell their goods and get into marketing.
I think it consumes a tremendous amount of resources, both personal resources in terms of your staffing time, and then personnel resources, and then also financial resources. And there are a number of organizations that spend a huge amount of money on advertising buys, and with the philosophy that you have to spend money in order to bring in money, and that when you're bringing in more money as a result of those expenditures, then you are able to expand your good works and do more of it around the world. So, that I guess, is that effective? Does it take away from the work of the organization? I think in large part it depends on the size of the organization, the values of the organization, whether they actually see that as a really significant thing that they need to invest in. But what's interesting for us as an organization is that we found, and our marketing director, James Topham, is here, we found that because of the potential that exists through social media and viral media, that you don't actually always have to spend any money at all, in fact, to start generating noise and discussion and to have people know about your organization and about what you're doing. And I think that now is the time for us to ask bigger questions around what kind of campaigns are appropriate? How are we portraying people who are living in situations of poverty and violence in other parts of the world? Is that respectful? Is that consistent with this message that we all, I think, are advocating for around making those local investments, putting local people at the front and center of those projects and activities, making sure that our work is collaborative, that it is genuinely grassroots, that it is that we are silent partners in that process, but that we are being useful and being supportive, but that we're not dominating. Most of the campaigns that we see that run in the mainstream media anyway go against those kinds of principles. And then we start to wonder why it is that we maintain low levels of development literacy, and why people do want to, I hate to, but, buy a goat or send books overseas or anything else like that.
Yeah, I mean, I want to share this. I mean, there is a situation currently in my country. You find NGOs paying their staff like 600 times colleagues of theirs that are probably in the government sector. I mean, I was telling Dan and my other friends that I've met, I'm like, my future goal is to work for an NGO because that's where I get paid better. I mean, that we need to come to a point where we can strike a balance so that we do not, the human resources that we are improving from the government side are not being siphoned into NGOs or are not being dragged back into NGOs where they just come in 2-3 years and then they are out. I think that we need to come to a compromise somewhere where we can check some of these.
I don't know if the spin and the focus on marketing makes NGOs work less effective, but I think it definitely creates a sort of culture of negative news, which is really bad when you are trying to, bring the beneficiaries up, and we don't get enough positive stories, as you mentioned. I mean, Ghana is not the country in Africa that gets the most news, right? It's Somalia, it's Sudan, it's where the crises are. And fair enough, those crisis areas need a lot of attention, right? But then the success stories don't get told. Sierra Leone, nobody talks about Sierra Leone anymore.
That's a tremendous point, because one of the big stories that surprises people over and over again the last couple of years is how well parts of Africa have actually been doing. And in fact, a lot of economists worldwide now are starting to see development growth there in certain areas, including areas like Ethiopia, former very hardship places, that are matching development that was seen in the Pacific. And I wondered if, as we start to see areas that were once seen to be hopeless starting to really move along, aid might be reconsidered in another way and said, well, look, they played a very important part in helping certain countries, and they will get more credit for that.
Could I just, I think, a lot of people in Africa and in other developing countries had very, very high hopes when independence came, very high expectations, probably expectations that couldn't be managed under the circumstances, obviously couldn't be managed under the circumstances. But I often say, if you look at the United States, 90 years after its independence, it had engaged in genocidal wars with the native people. It had a civil war that has been unsurpassed in violence in the years since, and any other number of calamities. I mean, why we would expect things to move faster under the circumstances that prevailed in developing countries, I don't know. You talked about, well, I think one of those questions had to do with new ways of doing things. Yes, of course, we should be open to new ways of doing things, but there's no substitute for staying the course. Children need to be vaccinated. Girls need to be educated. Some of these things just are going to take a lot of long, hard slogging, and no amount of fiddling and experimenting is going to change that.
For the long haul and be strategic and know what you're actually doing. I think we're just running over time now, so I would like to end on one more question about the new aid warriors coming along, that, and how we address our own young population to take aid seriously. Now, Samantha ruffled, you'll be surprised to hear this, a lot of feathers in her book by suggesting that some of the very prized operations many people have of sending their children to 2 weeks to Africa to help with a school or an orphanage or something really was kind of counterproductive. And I'd like you to just say a few words about that, but also give us, this is coming from a written question, also give us a sense of what could take the place of that hands-on experience. Because how do we get every young person in Canada to be given some kind of visceral sense of what aid is about and what is needed without having to go to these small trips?
Well, first, I'd like to thank my plant that put that question into the mix. I am a critic of for-profit ventures where young people in particular are spending upwards of $10,000 or $12,000 to get on a plane and to go somewhere for 2 weeks without actually understanding the context and the lessons of development, and without really being invested in some of the principles that we have discussed here around local communities and what good grassroots development actually looks like and what the priorities ought to be, and that it needs to be sustainable and all of these other questions. So I am very critical of that. And I really do believe that for any young person who is genuinely committed and interested in international development, that there are a number of ways that you can go about it that have far greater legitimacy and that will serve you better in the future when you are applying to groups like War Child and others for a job. And one of the things that we have found over the years is that we have a number of students who either start in high school or they start in university. They participate in War Child groups. They start a War Child group. They participate in volunteer initiatives with us here in Toronto. They participate in fundraising initiatives. They might volunteer in our office as interns or doing a whole number of things. They come and they work with us in the summertime. We have hired an extraordinary number of people out of those positions over the past decade. In fact, I would estimate that over the past decade, probably 30% of people that we ended up hiring at War Child came in some capacity from those volunteer positions. Those young people end up then being mentored, and they apprentice in our office so that they actually understand the lessons of development, what it means, what our work involves, and how they can contribute towards it. And then over time, some of those young people who are really interested in international programming end up working with us overseas. There are other ways, if you are looking to get involved, that you might be able to do that. That, in my view, experiences like that are among the most I think sustainable from a career perspective, but also the most meaningful for you and also for those organizations, and are most likely to set you on the path to a future career. There are certainly other ones that are also really good, and I list these in my book. Engineers Without Borders has a great leadership program for youth. Yet many of those young people end up working overseas, but for longer periods of time, anywhere from 3 months to 6 months, upwards of a year. You also don't have to get on a plane, and I think this is one of the critical messages. The work like the Enough Project and others, groups that are very much involved in advocacy, in policy discussions, in debates at the local level that have to do with international development and humanitarian assistance. You can easily get involved in those, and that's a good place to start, especially if you're not sure whether this is exactly the kind of thing that you want to do. And this is the last thing I will say about this. You don't need an excuse to get on a plane and to go to a developing country, to go somewhere in Africa, and to spend your tourist dollars in local markets and in local businesses and promoting and making those opportunities available for those local entrepreneurs. There is nothing wrong with that. Go and see the beauty and the wonder of Africa, because it exists right across the continent. It will astonish and amaze you. You will still be doing a very, very good thing, and you won't be paying a premium, A, for that privilege, and B, distracting yourselves with this kind of busy work philanthropy that may, in fact, be doing more harm than good.
Yeah, just to buttress what Samantha just talked about, I am a typical example of such a program. I've traveled all the way from Ghana to Canada on an EWB African Leadership Program. And it is not only a one-way traffic, or it's not only a one-way experience. We have EWBS coming to Ghana and not only staying in the cities or living in the cities, but going down to the rural communities where typically, to be very frank with you, I wouldn't want to live for a day or two. Trust me. But it gives you the experience, it gives you the exposure. Said that one day if you find yourself in top position like Rao is at the World Bank, you can make informed decisions. And I must be very frank with you, he's been bribing me, been having a tete-a-tete, he's been bribing me on that. But the truth is, when you have that kind of exposure from the ground perspective, when you find yourself in positions like Rao, is you are better able to make informed decisions. You are better able to commute and are in tune with the people that you're working towards or you're working hard to serve. And I think that is positive. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That was a very short.
I just got to say, I'm one of those people who went on these 2-week programs. But I thought the one that you paid $10,000 for was a scam, so I contacted the local organization in Ghana, actually. It was a great organization, Volu. And it's a partnership between foreigners and Ghanaians, and we built a school together. And I said, well, hi, do I need to be a part of this American area? So, oh, no, you don't have to pay anything. Come and volunteer with us. So it was great. I was just going to say that, my piece of advice to young people is, find some connection between whatever crisis country or developing country and yourself. If you eat chocolate, you're connected to Ghana and Ivory Coast. That's where the majority of the world's cocoa comes from. If you use a cell phone or a laptop, you're connected to Congo. That's where the most precious minerals in that laptop come from. And I'll make my last shameless plug. If you'd like to stay in touch and get involved in Congo work, and particularly in conflict minerals, we have a text message initiative. It's just launching now. So you can text the word Congo to 30644 and get monthly updates about what you can do. Thanks.
Well, I'd like to thank the panel very much indeed. It's been intriguing. It's a fascinating discussion, and it's really so much at stake in these discussions. And I'd like to thank all of you for your attention. And I remind you that the book will be signed by Samantha Nutt in the lobby, and it'll be quite a crowd there, so we're all looking to get to it. Thanks very much to all of you.